Chapter 8. The Parting of Lake Michigan. March 4th, 2086. Uninhabited Wilderness, Michigan. Nobody could fight anymore. The Stormbreakers and Wolverines were all down, their bodies broken and bloody. Most of the UN soldiers had fled. Cassandra was knocked out, and Inez could not move. Her arms and chest were burned, raw, red, and shiny, after her brief moment of contact with Cassandra's monster form. Inez crawled along the rooftop until she reached the edge. Looking down, she spotted Jericho standing over the defeated Stormbreakers. It all felt so surreal. Inez knew all about Jericho. She learned about the Savior during history lessons in the Bannack lab, and she'd seen countless shows on her television while living in Detroit. Inez knew all about the war in heaven and the battle for Earth. 50 years ago, Jericho was the most powerful scion in the galaxy. Now, she was the only one left. The only person with the gift. The gift was how Jericho had laid low the Stormbreakers in a single strike. Inez learned about that too. Jericho had a long list of incredible powers at her disposal. She could move things with her mind. She could read minds and control them too. Jericho could also siphon raw energy from her own soul and turn it into supernatural fire. Oh, and everybody knew Jericho could also bring back the dead. In the darkness, Jericho's blue eyes stood out in the rainstorm like a pair of will-o'-the-wisps. Her eyes narrowed, and the Savior raised one hand above her head and made a fist. The hair on Inez's neck stood up as she realized what was going to happen. Jericho was going to kill Lawrence, Varian, and the others. Panicking, Inez did the only thing she could think of. She cried out to Jericho, "No! Please stop! Stop!" Jericho paused and looked up at her. Sensing Jericho's intent to kill, Inez spoke quickly. "Don't hurt them, please! Let them go, and you can take us. We'll go with you, okay?" Inez gestured to herself and Cassandra, who was starting to wake up. Groaning in pain, Cassandra rolled onto her stomach and gripped her head in both hands. "Both of you?" Jericho said. Her voice somehow made itself heard above the driving rain. I can't leave her alone," Inez insisted. "Wherever she goes, I go with her." Jericho narrowed her eyes at Inez. For a moment, Inez wondered what Jericho could be thinking, but an instant later, such concerns were moot. Inez had never been hit with a psionic attack before. In fact, up until now, she'd never even considered what the experience would be like. Now she would know. Jericho's telepathic assault hit Inez and caused her to reel backward. Since she had no frame of reference to compare against, Inez compared the sensation of a mental invasion to that of a sexual assault. With overwhelming force, Jericho smashed her way into Inez's consciousness. Against her will, Inez was made to relive the past 4 days of her life in explicit detail. Each memory was pulled open and picked apart in the most minute of details. No scrap of information went unseen. Inez tried to push Jericho out of her mind to make it clear that this space was private, but Jericho did not even acknowledge these efforts. Once she'd seen what she wanted to see, Jericho withdrew, leaving Inez a shaking, quivering wreck. Lying on her side in the fetal position, Inez took one final look at Jericho. Jericho had closed her eyes very tightly and was clenching her fists. She looked like she was in serious pain and trying to hide it. Then, Inez felt multiple sets of hands grabbing her. She was lifted into the air and then carried to the far side of the roof. Both she and Cassandra were lowered back to ground level, and they finally spotted the blue helmets. about a dozen UN soldiers loaded Cassandra and Inez into the back of the very same APC the Stormbreakers had hijacked yesterday. The last thing Inez saw before the door slammed shut was Jericho herself. The savior of mankind turned away as the armored vehicle, fully loaded with UN soldiers and their two captives, started to move away into the darkness. Lawrence watched the APC go. He was sitting up against the overgrown remnants of the library wall. He spat blood and looked around at the Stormbreakers and Wolverines. Nobody was dead, but it was clear everyone had taken a serious hit and would not survive another one like it. From where he sat, Lawrence could see Jericho. She remained standing in front of the overgrown library until the APC was out of sight. Then she turned back to face the 10 downed fighters. "Espinosa has bought your lives," Jericho declared to the Stormbreakers and Wolverines. "Do not squander what she's given you." Suddenly, a cone of light illuminated the darkness. Somebody had gotten into the cockpit of the Niagara and fired up the spaceplane's floodlights. Twin shafts of light projected from the nose and refracted millions of times by the intense rainfall, lighting up the whole area. Jericho stared at the spaceplane for just a moment. So did Lawrence, and when he realized exactly who was in the cockpit, he could not help but laugh aloud. Nainu de Kunle, the tiny reptilian, had somehow managed to get aboard the ship. The bloody remains of his tail were still visible on the boarding ramp. Because he was seated inside the spaceplane, it was not possible to hear what he was saying, but Lawrence could tell that Nainu was shouting and cursing at Jericho. Once he finished his unheard cursing, Nainu vanished from the windscreen and the Niagara's ventral turret turned to face Jericho. With a loud screeching noise, the energy cannon fired. Bright red plasma spheres shot through the rain towards Jericho. She raised one hand and swept aside the oncoming spheres, causing them to dissipate and vanish into the rain. Each time Jericho deflected a plasma sphere, her face contorted as though a wave of physical pain was shooting through her body. Moving swiftly, Jericho deflected 5 blasts from the energy cannon, then stepped backwards and vanished into a sheet of rain. She was gone. Varian stumbled to his or her feet. "All right, who's not dead? Everyone sound off!" There was a general chorus of moans and groans all over the battle space. "Nainu!" Corder shouted from somewhere in the darkness. "You crazy lizard, don't ever change!" Piper helped the Wolverines get back to their feet. "What do we do now?" Setla lumbered to his feet, carrying Corder and Maui on his back. "I think we should all go to Alpina together," Setla told the group. "They made a mistake letting us live. We can take advantage of that, but not in our current state. We need to rest and regroup." The battered group made their way back onto the Niagara and raised the boarding ramp. About an hour later, the rainstorm finally ended and the spaceplane thundered down the highway. Lurching into the sky, the Niagara turned north. Inside the UN-controlled APC, Inez and Cassandra were being treated for their injuries, or rather, Inez was being treated. Cassandra was simply resting. Both girls occupied medical stretchers in the middle of the passenger area, and several men were pressing wet, cold cloth onto Inez's burns. She was in so much pain that she found it easy to ignore the fact that nearly all of the soldiers were quietly talking about how attractive she was, and how each one of them wanted to sleep with her. To her genuine horror, she saw that UN agent Yasin Ackerman was there as well, his broken fingers wrapped up in bandages. Next to Yasin was his partner, Malachi, the acolyte from the cult of Jericho. "Hey, you," Inez groaned, trying to catch the attention of Yasin and Malachi. "Where are we going?" Yasin jerked his free thumb at Cassandra, who was drinking water from a canteen. "We have to take her back to Bannack," Yasin replied. "Central will decide what to do with you when we get there." "Central?" Inez repeated. She took a closer look at one of the soldiers, taking in his uniform. She spotted a few patches she had seen before, such as the Space Ranger tab, which showed this man was an elite warrior. Then she spotted a second patch, located on the soldier's chest just above his heart. It was the letter X with 3 stars above it. "Oh no. Are you guys XCOM?" Inez dared to ask. Nobody replied, but the answer was clear. Inez shuddered and lay back, allowing the burn treatments to continue working. Escape just became a whole lot less likely. Inez closed her eyes. She needed to rest for just a moment. About an hour later, Muskegon, Michigan. Inez was jolted awake by the APC suddenly stopping. Malachi tapped her on the shoulder and told her to get to her feet. Cassandra followed behind. Inez, Cassandra, Yasin, Malachi, and the other 4 UN soldiers dismounted from the APC, while a small crew remained behind to operate the vehicle. As soon as her feet hit the ground, Inez picked up the smell of a beach and the refreshing winds of a lake shore. Even though it was the middle of the night, the rain clouds had parted and allowed the moon to illuminate the area. "Oh," Cassandra gasped. "Wow! Have you ever seen so much water before?" Inez looked behind her, and her breath caught in her throat. They were standing on the shore of Lake Michigan. One of the 5 Great Lakes that made up the region, Michigan is a vast body of water, so massive that when Inez stood on its eastern shore, she could not see the other side. In fact, she would not have been able to see the far side of the lake even in the daytime. It was just so big. To her left and right, sandy dunes rose up dozens of feet. An old-world lighthouse stood tall on one of the sandy hills, its beacon destroyed long ago. Yasin stepped away from the group and started talking into a radio. "Central, this is Strike 1. We are back on track, but there were some hiccups. We're going to miss our ETA and be late." A voice replied from the radio, and Inez jumped with surprise. She recognized the voice on the other side of the radio. She could not name the person on the other end, but she was very certain she knew who it was. "Understood, Strike 1. We'll keep the fires lit for you guys. What's your casualty count?" "We lost the Sky Ranger," Yasin replied, "plus 2 soldiers are KIA." "How are you getting back to Bannack without a Sky Ranger?" asked the voice of Central. "We've got some help," Yasin said. "She is here with us." "Praise be," replied Central. "We'll see you soon, Strike 1. Central out." Malachi tapped Inez on the shoulder. "On your knees," he said. "What?" Inez cried out. To her left, a soldier was forcing Cassandra onto her knees. Inez panicked instantly. 200 or 300 nightmare scenarios went through her mind right away. Obviously, the first thing Inez thought was that she and Cassandra were about to be murdered. Then she was afraid of being assaulted or worse. But all of her assumptions were thrown out the window a few seconds later when she looked around and saw that all of the soldiers were also kneeling down, their hands clasped as if in prayer. "What the hell?" Inez gasped. Malachi quietly reached up and grabbed Inez's shoulder. He told her to be quiet in a very stern voice. For a few moments, there was only the sound of waves crashing against the shoreline. And then Malachi started to sing. It was not a song in the conventional sense. Malachi was chanting very slowly in a deep baritone voice. His voice reverberated across the beach and off the clouds. Malachi repeated his deep chant 2 more times, and then fell silent. Inez felt the atmosphere change around her, the shifting of the mood. Jericho had arrived. Inez did not see exactly where she appeared. Jericho was just suddenly on the scene. Her robes, cape, and long white hair were caught in the wind and billowed about like sails. The Savior looked around the group of kneeling soldiers for a moment and then turned to face the west. Jericho looked out towards the thundering black waters of Lake Michigan. She raised her right arm, pointing into the distance. On Jericho's wrist was a gold band set with a blue gemstone. As Jericho raised her arm, this blue stone emitted a gentle light. A large ring made of light materialized in front of Jericho. It was divided into segments with lines, and each segment had a strange symbol inside of it. Jericho hovered her finger in front of one of these symbols, moving in exactly the same way Inez would interact with a hologram. The symbol Jericho selected glowed with incredible brightness. The circle vanished, followed by the markings it contained. There was a pause, followed by one of the loudest noises Inez had ever heard in her life. A roar like a rocket engine rumbled across the lake, causing the beach to shake so intensely that sand flew into the air. Inez felt the whole world vibrating beneath her, and her eardrums rattled painfully. The noise was so overwhelming that Inez wondered if the beach was about to split in half. Well, the land did not split. The lake did. With a great heave and deep rumble, Lake Michigan split open. Moving with unnatural speed and force, water raced north and south, opening a corridor of dry ground on the lake bed. About 20 feet wide, a path across the lake suddenly opened up, reaching out toward the horizon where the lake continued to open like a zipper in the distance. On each side of the corridor was a raging wall of water, as though Jericho had managed to stop a tidal wave from moving forward or backward. The soldiers got to their feet and started cheering. "Praise Jericho!" Malachi yelled. "Praise the Savior!" Jericho looked back at the group and waved her arm. With some alarm, Inez noticed that Jericho's face was strained and that her hand was shaking a little. "It's time to go," Jericho called to the group. And to Inez's surprise, the soldiers and the APC started moving into the watery canyon. Inez and Cassandra were made to stand up and start walking. Jericho went first, and the soldiers followed. Inez and Cassandra went after them, and the APC brought up the rear. As soon as they all stepped between the walls of water, it got dark, darker still than the pitch blackness all around. The sandy trail sloped downward, following the contours of the lake bed. Inez knew the Great Lakes were deep, but she did not appreciate how deep until she and the others had walked all the way to the bottom of Lake Michigan. Cassandra, frightened of the dark and noisy surroundings, jumped on top of the APC and stayed there. Inez did not blame her. She kept getting the sensation that there were massive fish on the other side of the water wall. Also, the trip was almost entirely downhill for the longest time. After about an hour and a half of walking along the path Jericho carved through the lake, Inez looked back and realized she had left a mountain behind her. They were near the middle of Lake Michigan. In front and behind, the ground rose hundreds of feet and out of sight. On each side, a wall of water rose up, imposing and terrifying. The APC had turned on all of its lights, but this only made the noisy darkness press into Inez even harder. She did not see a shipwreck until she almost walked headlong into it. The APC followed Jericho into a hole in the ship's hull, crushing the ancient metal to clear a path for the others to follow. There were 2 more shipwrecks and a gigantic skeleton in the lake bed. Inez really did not want to know what the bones used to be and ran ahead of the group. Right as she reached Jericho, the ground started to slope uphill for the first time. "Don't be afraid," Malachi shouted over the raging wall of water. "We're almost to the other side." The uphill journey seemed to take longer than the downhill one. Inez could only walk for about half an hour before she too jumped onto the APC, which was lumbering along as best it could in the sandy lake bed. After about 2 hours, everybody except Jericho was on the APC. Cassandra was crying. "Are we ever going to get out of here?" Cassandra asked. "Are we going to be down here forever and ever?" "I think we're going to get out soon," Inez reassured her. "Look, there's daylight." Inez pointed up. High up, the red light of the morning was just barely visible. It was a red line streaking through the middle of the sky, between the walls of water. March 5th, 2086, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. A small number of people still lived on the western shore of Lake Michigan. They were descendants of scattered survivors and resistance groups from the days of the Second Hyperspace War. Ever since the day when Jericho vanquished the beast, little to nothing of interest had happened in this part of the world. But on the morning of March 5th, anybody who was looking towards the sunrise from the shattered wreckage of Milwaukee would have seen something truly wondrous. The lake suddenly opened with a great crash, sending water flying in white clouds. A narrow corridor opened up as the water separated. In the early morning sunlight, it was very easy to see what emerged. Jericho stepped out of the pathway and up onto the beach. Once the APC and its passengers were clear of the lakeshore, Jericho turned back to the lake. Parting the lake for so long had clearly taken a toll on Jericho. She was pale and her face screwed up in a pained scowl. With one sweep of the hand, the 2 halves of the lake came crashing towards one another. The parting closed and a cataclysmic crash of water sprayed up into the sky. Like a sudden rainstorm, lake water thundered down onto the APC. And when the spray cleared, Jericho was gone again. March 6th, 2086. Bannack, Montana. Nobody had lived in the town of Bannack for over a century, but this didn't stop the area from being busy. The UN military base was buried deep underground, with only 2 facilities out in the open: a starship landing port on the nearby hilltop and a radar tower, concealed inside of a church steeple. Normally, the starship port was tended to by a skeleton crew, but today was not going to be a normal day. Nearly 4 dozen people were standing in the grassy field just beyond the landing area. Scientists, engineers, officials, and soldiers were all milling about in nervous apprehension. Then a noise broke up the sleepy Montana atmosphere. 3 spacecraft descended through the morning haze: a Sky Ranger and 2 UN starfighters. The starfighters, sleek and shiny, looked like flying blades. The Sky Ranger itself was a VTOL aircraft with a wide belly for transporting cargo or passengers. The starfighters flew in circles above the landing area, while the Sky Ranger extended its legs and made a pinpoint touchdown in the center of the starport. The Sky Ranger dropped its boarding ramp, and several people disembarked. One of them was carrying a blue flag emblazoned with the insignia of the United Nations military. He was doing his best to keep the flag as close as possible to a brown-skinned Malagasy woman with curly black hair. The commander of Bannack Base ran forward and greeted the new arrivals. "Welcome to Bannack, Admiral Siajotso. Even a surprise visit is a welcome one." Ingrid Siajotso was a woman in her late middle ages. She wore a military uniform adorned with many medals and ribbons. The words United Nations shone proudly on her chest, and on her shoulder was a patch representing the UN member state she called home, Madagascar. The ribbons on her chest denoted Admiral Siajotso's place in the military hierarchy. She was the supreme commander of all human forces. "You may dispense with the pleasantries, Commander. We're here to put you back on schedule." The Bannack commander balked at the Admiral's harsh words. "Admiral," he stammered, "I've said it before and I'll say it again. We're working as fast as we can, given the circumstances. The prototype Prometheus engine will be ready on time." Admiral Siajotso pointed her finger angrily into the commander's face. Every member of the base staff behind him quailed. "The Secretary General is losing faith in your capabilities, Commander. Public optimism without public result will be your downfall." The commander leaned in towards the Admiral and whispered, "Ma'am, the Secretary General doesn't appreciate the situation on the ground here. We cannot complete the engine without a catalyst, and the one we have on site won't be stable enough to use for at least a year. If you people can't get our missing catalyst back, then we're going to need a new one." Admiral Siajotso took a deep breath. She was trying to stop herself from losing her temper. "Fine then. Make your request to the Sec-Gen when he gets here." This time, the commander took a noticeable step back. He's coming here," the commander gasped. "Correct," Siajotso growled. "And I have been dutifully keeping him appraised of your failure to make progress. The Secretary General, the commander of XCOM, and myself will all be gathering here to discuss your failure and how best to rectify it." The commander regained his composure and straightened up. "We shall redouble our efforts, Admiral." "I hope so, for your own sake," Admiral Siajotso replied. Then she turned and began walking towards the entrance to Bannack Base, followed by her entourage of assistants, secretaries, and bodyguards. The staff of the base looked at their commander with terror in their eyes.